Test, test. There we go. All right. Well, good morning to everyone, and welcome to Lost River Church of Christ. We're continuing our study through the book of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. This is our 16th class overall, our third class now covering the book of Judges, and this morning we'll actually get into the narratives of the first four judges, the cycles that we kind of talked about in the last class. We've got three major judges to cover this morning, and then one minor judge. That's just based on the amount of information that we have off of them. But we'll start to see these cycles actually start to play out. But before we dive into our text this morning, let's go to God in prayer, please. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this opportunity to be gathered here this morning, to be able to open up your word, to study it, to be drawn closer to you and closer to each other. We hope that the things that we have to look at this morning will strengthen us, will encourage us, will cause us to willfully submit ourselves to you, to fight on your behalf, and to have a more solid and strong influence on the world around us than the world can have on us. Help us to take notes from these lessons, to apply it to our lives, and to make us better servants of yours. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right. So Scott used this last class on Wednesday. I too really enjoy the work that this group puts out. It's the Bible Project, I think it's .com. But they put together these videos that do a really good job with summaries of all the books of the Bible. And I wanted to hone in on this particular image from that video last week where it talks about the cycle of sin. A lot of us are pretty familiar in the book of Judges about the cycle that the people of Israel tend to go through. But one of the things I think that an image like this does is really illustrate that it is a downward spiral that the people go through, right? The chapter 2, verse 19 says that, and it came to pass when the judge was dead, that they, that is Israel, reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by following other gods to serve them and to bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings nor from their stubborn way. So when the people relent and they are delivered and they experience peace, then they revert and then they act more corruptly, more wickedly than they had before. So even though God is delivering them, God is saving them, it's kind of a one step forward, two steps back every time throughout these cycles. And it just gets worse and worse and worse as we go throughout the book. But the cycle, as it's kind of laid out here, is, Israel sins against God, they forsake God, they forget Him, they start to go after and serve these other idols, and like I said, have the influence of the people kind of outdo their own influence. Then God causes a rival nation, a foreign nation, to come up and oppress the people, to deal cruelly with them. The people will cry out to God. Here it says in repentance. We'll talk about that when we get into the story of Othniel just a little bit. But the people cry out to God. God has compassion on His people, and He raises up a Savior. He raises up a deliverer for His people. That deliverer goes to battle on the people's behalf, to war on the people's behalf, on God's behalf, able to subdue their enemies and then bring peace to the land. And it talks about the rest that the land experiences at the end of that warfare. And then the people seem to be doing okay during the time period while that judge is still alive, but as soon as that judge dies, passes on, they go right back to it, right? They go right back into their ways, they sin against God, and the cycle starts again, and this downward spiral continues down. This is another illustration that I thought did a pretty good job of explaining that. And you'll see the story not only play out in the lives of the people of Israel, but with the judges as well. It seems like, we start off with a judge that we'll talk about this morning in Othniel, who seems to be portrayed as kind of like the ideal judge or the preeminent judge, the one that all the other ones are supposed to be like. He's raised up by God. He delivers the people. There is rest. And actually in Othniel, or in the story of Othniel, is the only time in the stories of the judges that you'll have most specifically and explicitly all of those cycles, all the pieces of the framework of the cycle actually played out in the story of Othniel. And then things kind of get, a little bit worse and worse with each of the deliverers as we go on, ultimately ending up with Samson, right, who is the least ideal of all the judges. He's kind of the one that is arrogant, is puffed up, kind of the meathead type guy. But he ends up, instead of delivering the people and then being able to lead the people after that, he dies with the Philistines, right, in his narrative. And then no rest is mentioned at the end of his story. But nevertheless, despite the fact that we kind of even get worse and worse among the people and worse among the actual leaders, these tribal chieftains or the judges, God is still using these people, these individuals at his disposal to fulfill his ultimate will and purpose and further the story along, which is namely, in this instance, the delivery of his people who he cares about, who he wants to preserve, despite their constant and extreme lack of devotion to him. They're not deserving of the deliverance that he offers up, but nonetheless, he does that anyway. The beginning part of chapter 3, and we'll cover chapters 3 to 5 this morning. The first 6 verses there, kind of a quick review and kind of set the stage with what we'll be talking about. But back in Judges chapter 1, verses 27 through 36, we read about how Israel had failed to completely subdue the land, to completely drive out the inhabitants. They had failed in their complete conquest of the land that Joshua had started. And you read about their inability to do that. Then Judges chapter 2, verse 2, the angel of the Lord actually comes on the scene. It seems like that might still be at the time period when Joshua is still alive, but he's saying, I told you not to make any covenants with the people of the land. I told you not to get too close to them. I told you to go in and remove their gods from your midst, and you haven't done it. Right, you failed in that. Why have you done this? And all the people seem to have remorse. But then moving here into chapter 3, it lists off the nations that are left. And who does it say specifically they are left by? Yeah, these people are actually left by God, right? So we've read about, up to this point, the people failing to drive the nations out, but it was God who was the one that was ultimately doing the driving out all along the way. But here specifically it says that God leaves these nations. And then in verses 3 and 5, you have the actual list of the groups that are kind of left behind. They're given in 2 different instances there with slight deviations among the list. But you've got the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites. Okay? So these are the people, these are the nations that are left in the land. But what is the purpose of God leaving these nations with the Israelites? Yeah. Right.
It was solely, he gave the people an opportunity when Joshua released them to go and occupy the land. He was with them and he was fighting for them. If they would have done that,
sure,
these nations would have been kicked out.
Right.
So when they didn't do that, is when God comes back and says, okay, now that you didn't drive them out, I'm not going to drive them out for you.
Sure.
We're gonna stay in here. So I think that's important.
No, that's fair. Yeah, so the point being that if the people had been faithful in their service to God and done what he told them to do, as opposed to what the angel of the Lord comes and talks to them, why have you done this? If you had, just like the blessings and the cursings that are laid out in Deuteronomy, if you had, I would have been with you and I would have done that. But because you weren't, I'm not going to drive them out just because. I'm not going to drive them out just because I want you to have the land, right? The whole point was it's not your righteousness that's causing you to inherit the land. It's these people's wickedness. But if you're going to be like them and experience and play into the same type of wickedness, then you're no different than them. And so you'll be among them as well, and the people will stay there. But God is going to use that, as he always is able to do. He's going to take that into consideration. Yeah, Bobby. Mm-hmm.
Their daughters, and vice versa, and because they're going to teach you their God.
Yeah.
And then you'll serve him and not me. Therefore, I'm a jealous God.
Yeah, the whole point of the Israelites coming into the land was so that their influence, their godly influence, would overtake the land. And instead, it's the opposite that happens, right? It's the influence of the Canaanites, the leaven of the Canaanites, if you want to think about it that way, that permeates in Israel and kind of takes over. But God nonetheless is going to use the people that are remaining in the land to do something. He has a purpose for that. And what was that, Steve? What was the first thing you said? Yeah, to test them, right? He says in verses 1 and verse 4 here in chapter 3 that God's going to leave these people there to test them. Test them in what? Yeah, to see if you will obey the commands. I mean, these people are going to be a constant thorn in your side and always there to press you and tempt you, but I'm keeping them around to see if you're going to be faithful, to see if you are going to adhere to the commandments that I gave to Moses. Why else? He gives another reason, not just to test them in their faithfulness. In verse 2. Yeah, to train them up in the ways of war. There's a lot of people here as this new generation comes up that haven't experienced warfare like the people among Joshua in his day. So it's to train them so that they can be more effective in their service of God. So I think that's interesting, the fact that God keeps this or allows this rival nation, these tempters, to stay in the region, not only to test them, to prove out their own faith, but to train them and to make them stronger. All right? I think that's a good point for us there as well.
I think there's an interesting point here, too, that we need to remember. So, God is only doing what he promised he would do years before they came out of Egypt. You know, so I think it's an important, yes, God is using these purposes, but people ask all the time, you know, why does God allow these terrible things to happen? Why does he allow these nations to oppress them? Well, God is keeping his promise to do the bad things as much as he
Sure.
promised to do the good things.
Yeah.
You know, and that's an important lesson for us, is that if God lays on us these conditional requirements, if you are good, good things happen. If you're bad, these bad things happen. That's just as an important lesson to learn, that he will follow through on the bad things as it is that he will follow through on the good.
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, God is a keeper of his word regardless of the outcome, right? If it is for your betterment, yes. If it is for your detriment, the same holds true as well. Very good. All right, so like Bobby mentioned a second ago, you know, Israel's influence, they were supposed to come into the land and be the representation of God amongst the people of Canaan, but instead it's the people of Canaan who are a bigger influence on Israel, and ends up they start serving after their gods. So it ends there at that section, verse 6. It says that that is Israel, served their Canaan's gods. Right? They intermarried. They became extremely integrated with the people of the land, ultimately to the point, and that was the biggest stressor of all, that they served their gods. All right? So the people have now started to do that. And so we're introduced then to the first judge, who is Othniel. His story is relatively short. It's just 5 verses, so let's read that real quickly here. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Asherahs. Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. King of Mesopotamia. And the children of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. When the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel, who delivered them, Othniel the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and he went out to war, and the Lord delivered Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel the son of Kenaz died. So it starts off like we mentioned in the cycle. Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And what's that characterized by here? Yeah, serving the Asherah and the Baals. But even before that, the first thing that's specifically mentioned is they forgot the Lord. They forgot Jehovah. You know, it talked about, I think back in Joshua chapter 2, where after Joshua passes and the elders after him pass away, that there arose up a new generation that what? That didn't know God, right? So they've forgotten their God, and because they've forgotten and forsook their God, their Savior, ultimately, they started to serve after these other gods of the land, the Baals and the Asherahs. And what's the result of that? So they start to serve after these other gods, and then what happens? Yeah, so it says that God's anger burns against them, and he sells them into the hands of these foreign kings, these foreign oppressors. A very similar language to what we saw back in Joshua when Achan transgressed the covenant and kept of the dedicated things to God. It said that God's anger was burning against Israel, and he allowed them to fall at the hands of Ai. But here, the very similar language is used, but they've gone and after these other gods. God's anger burns against them, and it says that he sells them into the hands of these other kings. And the king that's mentioned here is Cushan-Rishathaim of Mesopotamia, and that's probably not his real name. Cushan-Rishathaim means dark or doubly wicked. So I think it's kind of the point being that this is the worst kind of oppressor. He's doubly evil. He's extremely bad. And it says that he comes from Mesopotamia, or if you might have the NIV version or some other version, it says Aram Naharaim, which means a ram between the rivers, which is Mesopotamia. That's back from where Abraham came from. So what might that tell us about that king? If he's from Mesopotamia and they're over here, Othniel, settled in the land of Judah. So what does that mean? This guy local? Yeah, he's from a very long ways away. The rest of the nations that we'll see the Israelites bump into are all kind of local inhabitants of Canaan. But this guy, Cushan-Rishathaim, is all the way over from Mesopotamia. So he is the worst of the worst and comes from the farthest place ultimately to come and to oppress Israel. And he rules over them, it says, for 8 years. And then it says that Israel cries out to God. All right, Israel puts up some sort of a plea or petition to God. And it's interesting, even though we talk about it in the cycle as this cry of repentance, there is not a specific reference to the people admitting guilt. Like we see that other times in the Old Testament, like with Nehemiah or with Daniel, where there's this confession, right? Or we've done something wrong, we've sinned, our fathers have sinned, we've done this wicked thing. And they have this confession, this admission of guilt. But here you just have them crying out. So it's almost like a reaction in a sense, this yelp of pain that they cry out to God when these bad things start to happen. Now it's good that they at least direct their cries in the appropriate direction. What you don't see is like we've seen in other places, a direct reference to a confession of their wrongdoing. So God sells them, because they've gone after these foreign gods, God sells them over to this foreign tyrant. But God hears their cries and acts out of compassion and love and care for his people, the people that he wants to save, and raises up a deliverer or a savior. All right, and he's mentioned as Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. So we've read about Othniel before. Where did we read about him? Anybody remember? You don't have to give me a book, chapter, and verse, but what was the story?
In both Judges and at the end of Joshua and the beginning of Judges, the same story is told.
Yeah.
That Caleb, when he goes to possess the land, he says, hey, who's going to go take this city for me? I'll give my daughter
Yeah.
as a prize. And so Othniel is the guy who steps up and becomes his son-in-law.
Right. So, like Scott mentioned, back in Joshua chapter 15 and in Judges chapter 1, you've kind of got the same story told where after they've divided up the land and Caleb is given a specific inheritance in the hills of Judah where the giants lived, right? Caleb wanted to go after the biggest and the baddest, but when Caleb's going to take that, he says, somebody go take this one place, Deber, and whoever, like Scott mentioned, whoever takes it, I'll give my daughter to them in marriage. And so Othniel steps up, says, yeah, I'll do it. And he goes and he takes it, and he ends up marrying Caleb's daughter and inherits specific land for him and for his bride, Caleb's daughter. They get plains, they get springs. Now there's a chance that he might not be an ethnic Israelite, right? Because it talks about Caleb and his background. It says that he's a son of Jephunneh, who is a Kenizzite, and they are listed among the inhabitants of Canaan when God is talking to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15, and then later they're also referred to as descendants of Esau. They're Edomites, right? So they're not descendants of Jacob. However, Caleb is referenced and described as a leader in Judah. He was one of the 12 spies. He's mentioned as the descendants of Judah in 1 Chronicles chapter 4. So I don't know if he actually is or isn't, but if he isn't, I think that stresses the depravity of Israel to have to be saved by something of an outsider, so to speak. And I want you to also note that Cushan-Rishathaim, the dark, the doubly evil one, is twice called a king in this section, right? And Israel is characterized at the end of the book, as we learned last time, that Israel had no king in the land. God was supposed to be their king. But here, Cushan-Rishathaim, king, dark, doubly evil, he kind of represents that evilness of that institution, and he's centered and kind of sandwiched around Othniel, who is the non-king. So it says that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Othniel, and he judges Israel. He leads Israel. They go out to war, and they're able to overpower dark, doubly evilness. They're able to overcome the wickedness of Cushan-Rishathaim. And it says that God delivers him into the hand of Othniel. So we started off where God sells the people into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, and now Othniel is reversing that punishment on the people by taking evil in his own hand and defeating that. Then it ends by talking about the land having rest for 40 years. All right, so first, Othniel here is presented as something like the first, the ideal judge. There's nothing negative that is either specifically said or even kind of alluded to or referenced about him and his conquest. He simply is raised up by God and then goes out and defeats the enemy. He demonstrates, like we read about, his previous willingness to go out and fight for God, for his people. He demonstrates this obvious trust in God, and he wins against the worst kind of the strongest oppressor from the farthest land. And he's kind of acts in tandem with God throughout his narrative really quickly. They're kind of presented as one and the same. But I think what's lacking in the more explicit detail of Othniel's story, is because the other stories will get a lot more detail, a lot more characters and events playing out. But the simplicity, I think, here shows the character of God. Puts out his glorification and punishing Israel and having compassion on his people and loving them and wanting their best when they cry out to him and delivering them despite their lack of deserving nature there. The rest of the stories will have a lot more human elements to them that seem to distract from the glory of God, and we'll talk about those starting with the next one. But the story ends there. Othniel dies, and then that picks up with the next judge and verse 12 there in chapter 3 of Ehud, and it starts off again the same way. After the previous judge Othniel died in verse 11, verse 12, again the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So who does he raise up this time? He raises up this king of the Moabites named Eglon. All right, and as we kind of move into the story of Ehud and Eglon, it's pretty interesting because there's a lot of kind of underlying humor and sarcasm and irony kind of played out in his story. We'll start to see a little bit more gory violence when you've got the explicit details of his assassination, and that kind of plays over into future stories as well. But Eglon here, his name means little bull or little calf, right? So it's almost like a play on words, because what do we know about Eglon that we'll read a little bit later? Yeah, he was very fat, right? He was a very fat man. So you've kind of got this early on in the story presented as, the first joke, if you want to call it that, is his name is Little Bull or Little Calf. So it's like a kind of a humorous nickname almost that he's given, because he was not little by any stretch of the imagination. But you'll see that play out, I think, a little bit later in the story, because you'll start to see some sacrificial language play out. So you've got this fattened calf, right, that will play in, I think, the story in just a minute. So he oppresses Israel for 18 years. Israel again cries out to God, and he raises up a deliverer. The deliverer is Ehud. And where is Ehud from? What tribe? Yeah, he's from the tribe of Benjamin, and there's a specific physical characteristic that's mentioned about Ehud here. What is that? Yeah, he's left-handed. Now that's pretty interesting, because the name Benjamin, does anybody know, anytime you see the word Ben in Hebrew, what does that mean? Yeah, son of, right? So Benjamin means son of the right hand, right? So you're going to see a little bit of sense of irony and sarcasm played out. Ehud, the left-handed son of the right hand, right? So that's who God raises up to deliver Israel here. And it says that by his hand, the people of Israel send Ehud to deliver this tribute to the king, right? They're going to offer up this tribute, this offering to King Eglon, and he goes to take that on the people's behalf. But before he goes to deliver that tribute, what does he do? Yeah, he makes a sword, this double-edged dagger, and he hides it in the in his inner thigh on his right thigh, right? Because he's left-handed. That'll play into the story. He'll be able to kind of get away with that and sneak that in unnoticed, because a normal right-handed soldier would have kept their sword on their left thigh and grabbed it that way. But it also kind of I think foreshadows the fact that this is a premeditated thought on Ehud's behalf to build this dagger ahead of time, to figure out how to strap it to his inner thigh, because you'll see in the next two judge cycles kind of makeshift weapons used, right? Shamgar will use an ox goad, and Jael will use a tent peg, but here Ehud is putting this together ahead of time. So they take this tribute and they bring it to this tyrant king who's described as a very fat man. His name means bull. And he takes this great personal risk and demonstrates, I think, a significant amount of faith in God to carry out his killing. But in the context of this downwardly spiraling nature of the judges, if you had to knock him in any sense, you would say that there's maybe a lack of faith in the deceit that he uses to kind of carry out his plan. And God, interestingly enough, isn't mentioned in the plan to assassinate Eglon at all. But he's only mentioned later in the story in the fighting against the Moabite army. But so you kind of almost see, in a sense, that Ehud doesn't appear to be of the same moral ilk like Othniel was, who was willing to just go up, fight, and win. But he's still better than the manipulative and doubtful Barak, who we'll read about in the next story. But in any case, I think like Rahab, his deceit is overshadowed by his willingness to take such a risky endeavor, the risky sacrifice that Ehud's willing to make, and the faith that he has in God to ultimately carry it out. So they bring this tribute up to Eglon. Again, you kind of see this offering made, so you've got the sacrificial kind of background for what's happening. And they take the tribute to the king, and then they leave. And as they're on their way out, they stop at the stone images of Gilgal. And Ehud turns back and says, "I've got to see Eglon. I've got a secret message for him." So he goes into King Eglon and tells him, "I've got a secret message for you." So Eglon tells everybody to leave, get out, get silent. So they're in there alone, and so maybe Eglon's thinking, okay, he went to the stone images at Gilgal. Maybe he's received some kind of a secret message from the gods. Maybe he's got something important to tell me, so I want to be alone to receive this private message. So that adds some plausibility to the reason that Ehud would have wanted to have a private meeting. So they're sitting alone, it says, in the cool private chamber of Eglon. So, that along with Eglon's plumpness is probably kind of emphasizes the fact that this king, these Moabites, have kind of gotten rich off of the back of the Israelites and tributes like this one that they are paying. But in any case, they're alone. He says, "I've got a message from God to give you." And ironically, the message is a two-edged sword, literally and figuratively. And they get close together, and Ehud reaches with his left hand to his right thigh, pulls out the dagger, and then just completely buries it in the gut of Eglon, so much so that the hilt is said to go all the way in, and the fat of Eglon completely engulfs this knife, and he's not able to take it out. And then in your English Bibles, it probably tries to clean it up again a bit. It says that his entrails poured out, but he defecates all over himself when this happened. And so Eglon got the message from God. Ehud is then able to go out, and he locks the doors behind him, and then he seemingly is able to kind of casually walk away from this assassination. And he's able to escape because Eglon's attendants are afraid to disturb the king who's behind locked doors. They think, well, maybe he's just he's relieving himself. He's having a bathroom break. Again, some more irony because he did. And so after, they wait some time to the point of embarrassment, the text says, okay, it's been too long. So they get a key, they unlock the door. When they go in, they find their fallen king. So the king is actually defeated. This fatted calf is offered up as a sacrifice before the battle even takes place, right? And that kind of sets the stage for their victory to come. But Ehud has already made it out of town while they were waiting. He made it past those stone images so that, he passed the point of no return, makes it to the mountains of Ephraim, and he calls out for the people. He blows the horn of battle for them to all come to him. And the people do. They follow him into battle, and he says, follow me, for this is the day that the Lord has given the Moabites into your hands. So he leads Ephraim, specifically as mentioned there, in battle, and they kill all 10,000 of the fighting men. And the men there of Moab are noted as strong, as noble men, right? So again, you kind of think about the fatted calf that was offered up in Eglon, and now here the best are destroyed and offered up to God. So they're completely victorious over the Moabites, and the land has rest for 80 years, it's mentioned there. You'll see throughout the story of Ehud, you've got this continual repetition of the word hand, right? It was Ehud, the left-handed man, and it was by his hand that the tribute of Israel was taken up to Eglon. And when he got there, he used his left hand to grab hold of the knife and to plunge it into Eglon. Then God gives Moab into Israel's hand, and the Moab is subdued that day by Israel's hand. All right, so you've got that mentioned 5 times in this text, this repetition of the word hand, both in the Hebrew and English. But I think that stresses Israel's, along with the presence of God, their active involvement in what's happening, as opposed to passivity and just standing on the sidelines and watching this happen. But that'll be a theme I think that you'll see come up and play in the story of Deborah and Barak in the next section. But before we get to that, there's one small verse, chapter 3, verse 31, where we talk about Shamgar. It says, after him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad. He also delivered Israel. So he's the first minor judge that's mentioned, where you've just got one little blurb about him and his story. Just a little bit from what we can maybe ascertain about Shamgar. He, again, was most likely not an Israelite. His name seems to have Canaanite origins. It means Simji gives, and Simji was a Hurrian sun god. He's also called the son of Anath. That could have several different meanings. It could mean that he was from Beth Anath, which is mentioned in Joshua and Judges. It could mean that he was associated with a group of mercenary-type assassins who we learned about in Near Eastern records, who called themselves the sons of Anath, because Anath was a Canaanite goddess of war. So possibly that Shamgar was like a professional fighter, a professional mercenary, so to speak. But all we really know about him is that he kills a bunch of Philistines with an ox goad. All right. Now, an ox goad, there's a picture of one here, but goad literally means an instrument of learning, right? An instrument of training, all right? So it's this tool that's used to kind of train oxen when they're pulling the plows to kind of keep on a particular path. Whenever I hear the word goad, my mind always goes to Saul, when his conversion story, and Jesus calls out to him and says, is it hard to what? To kick against the goads, right? Have you not learned enough to figure this out? You're not learning your lesson. Is it hard for you to kick against this learning instrument? And actually, it's pretty interesting. I think it's Festus that when he's recounting his story, Festus said, Saul, all your learning is driving you mad, or Paul, all your learning is driving you mad. So maybe a play on words with that term goad there. But in any case, Shamgar teaches with an ox goad, its training tool, teaches the Philistines a lesson, just like Ehud gave Eglon a message. And it says that he also delivered Israel. And then we move into chapters 4 through 5 with the story of Deborah and Barak, and Judges, like I said, 4 through 5. Starts off there saying that Ehud is dead. All right, so the last judge has died, and again, Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord. So this time, God raises up Jabin, who is said to be the king of Canaan. Even though he's mentioned there as the king of Canaan, kind of the leader of the force that is oppressing Israel here, he's not the main character, not the main antagonist in the story. Who is? Sisera, right? His commander, and his commander has what at his disposal? Yeah, those 900 chariots of iron, right? And we've kind of read about how Israel didn't seem to fare too well in warfare against chariots of iron, but God sells the people into the hands of Jabin and Sisera, and it says that they cruelly oppress Israel for 20 years. Then we're introduced to Deborah, whose name means honeybee, and we'll see that play out in just a little bit, I think. But what does it say about Deborah? What does it say about honeybee? Yeah, she was a prophetess. She was a prophet. What was she doing? Yeah, she was leading Israel. She was judging Israel. It actually specifically talks about her maybe in the more traditional, our traditional thoughts about judges. She was kind of handling issues. People would come to her for judgments, all right, at her place, the tree of Deborah. But she is a prophet. She acts as the mouthpiece of the Lord, and because she's the mouthpiece of the Lord, she calls on Barak to come up and to rise up to be God's deliverer. Right. So Barak is supposed to be the deliverer in this instance, and she says to him, Barak is from Naphtali, and she calls him to be Israel's deliverer, Israel's savior here on God's behalf. But she starts off that section saying, "Has not the Lord?" Right, so you kind of got this negative question already starting off and setting this stage with Barak. Has not the Lord done this? And you'll see her; she'll repeat something very similar right on the cusp of battle. But she says, "You're supposed to rise up men from Naphtali and Zebulun, take 10,000 men, and you're going to lead this fighting force against Sisera." And she prophesies and gives specific instructions on how that's going to happen, that God is going to pull out Sisera to a particular place, to the river Kishon, and that's where all this is going to go down, and we'll see that play out in just a moment. But he says that, or she tells him that God will deliver you, that this is a for sure thing, prophesying that this is going to happen. You can trust in God that this is going to come to pass. But what's Barak's answer? Yeah. I won't go unless you go. If you don't go, then I'm not going. So he kind of offers up this ultimatum. His response to Deborah's command to listen to what God says, the assurance of victory that she gives, even the specific nature of how it's going to happen. He says, "I won't go unless you go." There are two ways to look at this. One, you could say that he's requesting the presence of God to go with him into battle. The Septuagint adds a statement where it says, "I never know what day," this is Barak talking, "I never know what day of the angel of the Lord will give me success." So in a sense, you could say that he is saying, "I want you to be with me so that I know what to do and when to do it. I need you, I need God with me." So that's one way to look at it. The other way is to look at this as a display of doubt and maybe even of cowardice, that he is lacking in faith in what God has said that he would do, similar to how Gideon in the next story, needs assurance after assurance after assurance to go ahead and go through with everything. But what's Deborah's response? Yeah, she says, "Okay, surely I'll go with you. Certainly I'll go with you, but the honor, the glory won't be yours because of the decision you're making." So that kind of plays into the sense that this is probably more the latter of the two options I gave you just a second ago, that he's displaying this lack of trust and faith in God and trying to manipulate Deborah, manipulate God to get his outcome. But she says, because that's the path that you've chosen, you won't have the glory, but the glory will go to whom? What's even worse than just not getting the glory? It's going to go to a woman. Now, at this point in the story, who are you led to believe that woman is? Deborah, right? But that's kind of the twist that we'll see in just a moment. But in any case, Barak then goes, he gathers up the army and gets the 10,000 men. So that probably shows a little bit about the faith of the people, at least in this time, that he's able to muster this 10,000 men fighting force. Deborah goes along and they gather up together. And then in verse 11, you have this kind of shift of the scene over, and you're introduced to a man named Heber the Kenite, right? And who was he? Does anybody remember who it says he was? He's a relative of Moses, right? He's a descendant of Moses' father-in-law, right? I think the New King James Version says this, that Heber is his father-in-law, but it's more like his brother-in-law. So he's a descendant from them. We'll learn a little bit later that this family, this group, has some type of a peace or truce with Jabin. That'll come into play a little bit later, but you're just kind of quickly just introduced to him, and then it goes right back to the story. Sisera hears about what's going down. He hears about the army that's starting to gather, this 10,000 men fighting force, and he, in response to that, gathers up his own army, gets his 900 chariots, and they gather right where Deborah prophesied they'd be. They go right down to the river Kishon, right where Deborah said they would, or right where God, through Deborah, said they would go. So already from Barak's standpoint, this should be instilling confidence that God's will is coming to pass, that what God said would happen is starting to happen. And again, Deborah has to say, get up, go, rise. This is the day that the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. And she actually says, again, has not the Lord gone out before you? So again, you kind of see her having to push him along in that negative type question that she's asking him. Has not the Lord gone before you? And what she's referring to there will be discussed, I think, in a little bit more detail in her song. But Barak goes down, and it says that God routs Sisera's army, right? The army is completely defeated, mainly because of God's intervention. And we'll see about that in her song. It seems like God calls the heavens to open up, this massive rain to come down. The river of Kishon overflows. And if you've got this wet and muddy terrain, what does that mean for your chariots? Yeah, they're completely useless, right? So what we saw back in with the tribe of Judah and, their inability to overcome the enemy who have their chariots, it seems like chariots aren't really a match for God. Iron chariots are no match up against God. But despite their beating the army, taking the army, routing the army, says that Sisera escapes. He jumps down off his chariot and he flees on foot. But he runs to the tent, the dwelling place of Heber the Kenite. So he's mentioned again, but it's not him that's actually going to be the hero of the story. Jael, his wife, comes out, sees Sisera and says, come inside, come into my tent, don't be afraid. Now, we'll see this in just a second, but Jael, her name means mountain goat, all right? And whenever Sisera comes into her tent, he says, I'm thirsty, please give me some water to drink. What does she give him? Yeah, she gives him milk. All right, so her name is Mountain Goat. Maybe a play in the way she's giving him milk, but that was an ancient Near Eastern custom to offer milk. She gives him a blanket. Says in Deborah's song that she gives it to him in a lordly bowl. Right, so she's showing him a lot of hospitality, and so he's kind of made a little bit more gullible by the hospitality that she's showing him. Says, okay, well, I'm going to come in here, but you keep watch. If anybody comes around asking for me, you haven't seen me. All right, so he lays down, he goes to sleep, and while he's sleeping, she picks up a tent peg, she picks up a hammer, and goes over to him, nail to the temple, and with the hammer, she blows that nail right through his head, and says that it goes all the way down into the ground. So you've got that kind of vivid description of the assassination of Sisera. But then Barak comes around, and he's still pursuing Sisera, so maybe he's still pursuing that glory, trying to get it for himself, even though it said it wouldn't be his. Sisera comes out to meet him and says, I know who you're looking for. Come into my tent, and I'll show you. And so he comes in, he sees Sisera laying there dead. So you've got two commanders in Jael's tent. One is dead at her hand, and the other one, also at her hand, has robbed Barak of his honor, and that should have been his. So Jael is revealed to be the woman that would take the honor here. So you've got in this story, taking over the land. Jabin was the king of Canaan. Sorry, I kind of got behind there. Jabin was the king of Canaan, which was described as the land flowing with milk and honey. And you've got Deborah the honeybee and Jael the mountain goat, the producer of milk, kind of making that possible for them to take that. I think that's another kind of play on words and the irony there. But then you get into the song. One of the main things I just want to point out to you real quick before we close. One of the big themes of Deborah's song is the people's willingness to or willfully give themselves over to the cause of God. And you've got that played out in contrasting elements where you've got the people that go off to serve other gods versus the people that offer themselves up to the true God, Jehovah. And then you've got actually listing out of the tribes who risked their lives to see God's will come to pass versus the tribes that stayed behind and in pursuit of their own self-interest, watching after the sheep, manning their ships, watching their bays. And so you kind of see that. I think that's a message for us to the pride and the blessing that are laid out on these people who actively get involved as opposed to the people who just wait by on the sidelines for these things to happen to them. All right? So that's the first 3 cycles, and we'll pick up